There's a terrifying secret lurking in El Yunque National Forest in Puerto Rico, and not only is this tropical paradise allegedly home to something that's been preying on local livestock, but there's speculation that a hidden government lab nestled in the jungle could be connected to its origins. Is it a secret military experiment gone wrong? The product of extraterrestrial collusion? The truth might shock you. You won't want to miss this one. In August of 1995, Madeline Tolentino, a housewife in Puerto Rico, was at her mother's home around 4 p.m. in the afternoon when she just happened to glance out the window and see something strange. She saw a person out on the street, and at first, she couldn't see what he was looking at. All she could tell was that he looked frightened and he was backing up. Madeline thought it looked like the man was waiting for something to pounce on him. And then, after changing her angle, she finally saw what he was looking at. And she understood exactly why he was so afraid. There, down the narrow street outside, was another figure. And whatever it was close enough and moved slowly enough to give her a good look. It wasn't very tall at all, only standing around 4 feet. While it walked on 2 feet like a person, any similarities to a human being ended there. The first thing that Madeline noticed were the eyes. She described them as dark gray, maybe even entirely black, and she explained that they were damp and protruding, running up to its temples and spreading to the sides. There was also no nose, only a pair of tiny holes in its face and only the slightest hint of a mouth. The small slit that sat where the mouth should be never opened the entire time that she watched, and this being drew closer to the witness outside on 2 long, thin legs. Each one ended in a webbed 3-toed foot, like a goose's. Now, the thing was closer than ever, and so Madeline kept taking in more details, and she explained that the entire body was covered in skin that spanned a variety of colors. And in some spots, it looked brown, in others it was black or gray. Here and there, however, certain spots looked ashy, as if this thing had survived serious burns. There were even some of these spots that looked like the thing had been burned so badly that some of its skin had fallen off, revealing this purplish, pinkish flesh beneath. But the thing was covered in stuff besides skin. There was also hair on top of its head and what looked like feathers on its lower back, and these moved on their own. And most of the time, the feathers laid flat, but every now and then they would twitch rapidly, pushed and pulled by reddish membranes that ran the length of this thing's spine. But as alarming as this thing's appearance was, its behavior was even more frightening. Madeline explained that it had 3 long, skinny fingers, and that its arms were also very long and were drawn back in a attack position as though it were a TV monster. And then something dawned on Madeline. She had to get someone else to see this thing. So she called out for her mother, who quickly rushed to her side, and together they stared at this thing stalking the street outside their window. And that's when Madeline drops closer to the floor, not to hide, but to try and get a better look. And as she got down to the floor, she looks out to see if this thing had genitals, but couldn't make out anything. And so she's laughing at the sight of this crotchless person or being and says to her mom, "What the heck is this thing? Does it just defecate through its mouth after it eats?" And she's not sure what to make of it. But the more she sits there and she's watching this odd being, she noticed that it's acting strange, like it's robotic and being controlled by someone or something. Now, normally, such an observation might have struck her as funny, but it wasn't, because Madeline realized something in that moment. this thing was no longer looking at the man outside. It was looking directly at her. And so what happened next all passed in a blur. Madeline screamed, and in an incredible display of bravery, the moment that her mother heard her daughter scream out, she didn't run and hide. Instead, she took off into the yard, straight in the direction of this being. And now, Madeline looked out the window and could see that two people were chasing after this monster, her own mother and a local boy that she knew who sometimes helped her husband with chores and other various things around the house. And she watched as they ran after this animal, which is now bounding into the tree line, hopping away like a kangaroo. Now, it's not clear exactly how long the two of them were gone. All that Madeline knew is that after a while, both of them had returned. And Madeline explained that after she saw this thing plunging into the woods, her mother and the boy had ran after it and tried to capture this thing. Now, apparently, as the boy got close enough to try and grab this thing, he realized it didn't have feathers. Instead, it had long spines that were changing colors and that its mouth pried open and revealed very large fangs. And even then, something stranger had happened. It began moving much faster than it already had, disappearing into the brush for good. What's even stranger is that this thing's feet weren't even touching the ground. It was as if it had been suspended in the air and just floated along. Basically, the boy and Madeline's mother lost sight of it after that. All told, the event has several witnesses. Madeline, her mother, her husband at the time, the boy who chased the thing, and several other people on the street who watched the entire thing unfold. But the event was far from over. To the contrary, because word of this creature would soon spread throughout the Caribbean, or I guess Caribbean, then into the mainland United States of America and across the world. Now, Canovanes, the location where Madeline Tolentino first described the Chupacabra, sits on the border of El Yunque National Forest. El Yunque is notable as the only tropical rainforest that's managed by the U.S. Forest Service and National Forest System. And as it turns out, there's been a lot more Chupacabra sightings in Puerto Rico, and guess where they're centered around? El Yunque. Today, tourists flock there for its picturesque scenery, which stretches out over 28,000 acres. But the history of El Yunque has a lot more to offer than just nature, but we'll get to that. First, we need to go back in time just a little bit. You see, although Madeline Tolentino's dramatic sighting from August 1995 was the first time anyone ever officially described this creature in any detail, it was really just a matter of time because, as it turned out, Puerto Rico was in the middle of a rash of gruesome livestock mutilations, meaning that whatever Madeline saw might be related in some way or another. Now, as far back as the 1970s, farmers in Puerto Rico were experiencing trouble with their own animals. And back then, everything from chickens to goats, even full-sized cattle, were falling victim to a mysterious predator. Every time that the bodies were examined, they revealed two very disturbing details. You see, the bodies of each animal always had two puncture marks on their sides, and they were always drained of blood. In fact, it was said that not a drop of blood remained in any of the corpses once they were discovered. What gives? And so, farmers in Puerto Rico began searching for the culprit. A lot of the incidents during this period all happened around the town of Mocha. In short, this led to newspapers dubbing the invisible attacker the Vampire of Mocha, or the Mocha Vampire. But others weren't exactly convinced. They blamed all sorts of things, from UFOs to what people claimed was a vampire serpent bird that would swoop down in the middle of the night to drain the blood from livestock. Newspapers even published a picture of one of the specimens seen here, Clearly, this was just a clever creation by unethical taxidermist, but it left many people feeling safer, thinking that the predator had been caught. That, and the fact that these attacks seemed to come in waves. In fact, about 15 years passed before the next round of vampire attacks began. Then, in the early 1990s, it all started up again. So things kicked off around March of 1991 in the area around Lurks, Puerto Rico. And it was just like in the 1970s, the bloodless bodies of pigs, fowl, and other animals were discovered with fang marks on their sides. Remember, this is still 4 years before Madeline Tolentino's sighting. While no one described the attacker in any real detail, a few brave farmers and residents still stepped forward to claim that they had caught a glimpse of whatever was killing their animals. But unlike Madeline, their descriptions were always vague, barely seen glimpses in the middle of the night. Some said it resembled an ape, others said it looked more like a big dog, and it was always too dark to see. And so local authorities quickly seized on this explanation. When confronted with incidents like the 9 pigs found drained of their blood in the town of Camoy, civil defense officials simply declared the killing as nothing more than the handiwork of a hungry dog. However, folks, the locals knew differently. They knew that no hungry dog would leave the bodies intact. Now remember, there was never any actual dismemberment in any of these cases. The animals were drained of blood, not eaten, and if a dog wanted to drink an animal's blood, they just weren't built that way. Whatever was harming livestock in Puerto Rico in the early 1990s was just like the killings of the 1970s, designed to drink blood. Clearly, the local population felt ignored by their leaders, and this led to citizens in places like Barrio Pezuelas taking to the streets at night, patrolling the countryside with clubs and torches to try and find and slay the vampire that threatened not only their livelihood, but their families as well. In fact, one concerned resident, a farmer and public school teacher named Hector Colon, became an advocate for the population, and he had told a local news station in April of 1991 that he was a farmer and he could tell you that these deaths were abnormal. But the deaths just kept piling up. There was no way to say for certain just how many farmers were impacted by these attacks, but we know that they spread out into adjacent areas that summer. And now, in addition to blaming a mysterious ape or an oversized dog, people started reporting large, strange cats that seemed capable of vanishing into thin air. And even if they hadn't been capable of disappearing, these cats would have been odd in their own right. In fact, the biggest mammals in Puerto Rico that aren't an invasive species are bats. Now, despite all this evidence, authorities still stuck to their guns, insisting that especially aggressive, although completely normal, dogs were to blame. And then the killings stopped again for several years, only to pick up again in 1995. And they brought with them new evidence that something truly unusual was happening. You see, one of the most noteworthy attacks happened on March 21st, 1995. Basically, a reputable local farmer named Mr. Barreto claimed that his sheep had fallen victim to some unseen predator. Several investigators quickly visited his property to examine his claims the very next day. On his website, Inexplicata, researcher Scott Corrales wrote this: Barreto's testimony indicated that the animal deaths began on March 10th when he realized some certain sheep were missing at feeding time. Puzzled as to the situation, he was later shocked to find a considerable number of his flock dead. Saddened but not overly preoccupied, he didn't think to file a police report, ascribing his losses to the predatory activities of some wild dog. But when more animals turned up dead in the days that followed, the farmer was intrigued by the unusual puncture marks on their necks. It was then that he decided to file a complaint with the municipality's police. researchers were quick to seize upon the most obvious evidence on the Burrito property, the strange three-toed footprints covering the ground. This fact ruled out a dog or wildcat attack, since canines and felines have 4 toes. Further analysis proved there was an 18-inch distance between footprints, suggesting that whatever creature they belonged to was bipedal rather than quadrupedal. Its weight was estimated at between 120 and 140 pounds. Besides being drained of blood, the bodies of the sheep were examined with a Geiger counter. The researchers determined that they gave off radiation readings that were abnormally high. There was even speculation that the bodies had been injected with radiation. After all, each of them seemed resistant to decomposition, and until now, people in Puerto Rico had given their attacker a long list of names. But it wasn't until the 1995 sighting that any of them stuck. While discussing the livestock mutilations on a San Juan radio station, radio DJ and comedian Silvero Perez jokingly made a reference to the attacker being a goat sucker, or sucker of goats, in Spanish, El Chupacabras. In the years since, the name has been shortened and Americanized to the degree that if you simply mention the Chupacabra, people know exactly what you are talking about. Granted, it's become kind of confusing over the years. Today, the term is also applied to sightings of cryptids that look a lot more like hairless dogs. These cases are especially common in the southwestern United States. In a lot of these cases, that's all they are. Dogs, coyotes, or dog-coyote hybrids, afflicted with a bad case of mange that causes all their hair to fall out. However, we're going to continue on with the original descriptions from Puerto Rico, where they appeared as bipedal monsters blamed with draining blood from livestock. Now, so far, we've talked about Madeline Tolentino's sighting and all of the events that happened before, but it's not like these attacks were just leading up to August of 1995. No, they continued long afterward. For 6 weeks after her sighting, the area around Madeline's community alone, the town of Canovanes, had to deal with continued livestock mutilations. The activities continued to spread throughout Puerto Rico for even longer, and by some estimates, up to 150 different types of farm animals all fell victim to the Chupacabra. All of them showed more or less the same thing: puncture wounds on their bodies which were drained of blood. Now remember, most of the mutilations before Madeline's 1995 experience didn't feature any Chupacabra descriptions, but we can't say the same thing about the encounters afterward. Now, tons of people were describing something similar prowling the Puerto Rican jungle, a short creature that resembled a feathered or spiny gray alien preying on livestock. Here and there, witnesses added other details. Sometimes they thought they saw wings, sometimes its eyes glowed red at night, sometimes it hopped or scuttled or even floated or flew. Gee, is this a Dr. Seuss book? Anyone unlucky enough to get a closer look even described fangs, or even more bizarre, a long tongue or organic tube coming out of its mouth that is used to suck all the blood out of its prey. Now, whatever the description, Madeline Tolentino's sighting was like a dam breaking, and people came forward with more and more detailed descriptions. Just over a month after Madeline's sighting, a rash of animal attacks hit the farm of Felix Rivera, a farmer in Guaynabo. Now, a week later in early October, a witness named Misiel Negron watched something in Madeline's hometown of Canovanes. Misiel was standing outside his own house on the balcony. Though the lighting wasn't great, he was left with the impression that this thing was hairy like a bear. Misiel observed it for about 10 minutes before it realized it was being watched and then took off. And then, when Misiel shared his sighting with his family, he learned that his brother had actually been chased by something very similar to his description. His brother said that when he first saw it, this thing had been standing beside a dead goat. Interesting, isn't it? Now, until this point, none of the local officials ever listened to the eyewitnesses. But eventually, even Puerto Rican authorities began taking sightings a little more seriously. Remember, they had always insisted it was just a big hungry dog that was just simply attacking animals. Now, some government employees like Ismael Aguayo had changed their tune. Ismael was a member of a civil defense rescue unit. When speaking to the New York Times about Chupacabra eyewitnesses, he just claimed that there are people from rural areas who know what animals look like. Those calling are serious people. Some have been so affected that they have had to be taken to the hospital. In fact, the public outcry became so great that the mayor of Canóvanas, Jose Soto, was forced to organize a search party of his own. 2 days before Halloween, Jose gathered 200 of his constituents and sent them out into the wilderness, armed with tranquilizer darts, nets, and other ways to capture this elusive creature. He even used a goat as bait. Of course, they captured nothing. But just because the search party didn't find the Chupacabra, it didn't mean that others didn't. Sightings continued to flood in, and in one example, a security guard at a pharmaceutical company saw not one, not two folks, but 3 for the one-time payment of $19.95 while on the late shift. He resigned shortly thereafter. Guess he didn't have $20. Sightings even came from highly reliable sources, and one of them was Jose Colazo, a law enforcement officer. You see, Jose and his wife were just settling into bed around 11 one evening when they heard something. It was the alarm on his new Toyota being set off outside. Jose immediately grabbed his .357 Magnum, sure that someone was trying to steal his new car. But what he found was much worse. So Jose heads out to the carport and he's expecting to see a criminal, but the first thing that greets him is his dog. Well, it doesn't exactly greet him, it's got its attention elsewhere. In fact, his dog is growling and howling, and so Jose peers through the darkness and finally manages to make sense of what's happening. Jose's dog is locked in this life or death struggle, and it's tumbling around on the driveway with something else just a little bigger than it is. Jose thinks it's another dog, and then he realizes that no dog should have had such big eyes and spines and fingers. Well, as it turns out, Jose is a great shot, and he manages to hit the attacker dead on, bam, narrowly missing his own dog. But how the creature reacts is very strange. Instead of running away, this thing somehow manages to tuck its head between its legs and somehow rolls or bounces into the wall of the carport, then ricochets out into the street. Jose never fired a second shot. He was simply too embarrassed to admit it, but he said he was afraid of hitting his new car. But yet he wasn't afraid of killing his dog. We know where Jose's priorities are. However, the single shot that Jose did fire left behind clear evidence in the form of blood, hair, and a disgusting smell that lingered in the carport for days afterward. This stench has been reported in a number of Chupacabra sightings. In fact, eyewitnesses have even compared this odor to everything from battery acid to pesticide to paint thinner, even the demonic smell of sulfur. So look, it's impossible to cover every Chupacabra sighting during this period. I mean, you could probably dedicate 3 videos just to Chupacabras in Puerto Rico just in 1995. There really are that many stories, but what's interesting is how the Chupacabra phenomenon seemed to overlap with other mysteries. I mean, UFO sightings were also popping off all over Puerto Rico during this time frame. There are even stories involving UFOs and Chupacabras. A good example of this is a story from November 18th, 1995. You see, according to eyewitness Jose Arriaga and several others, an enormous flying saucer appeared above a Baron Quitas radio station around 7:20 p.m. And the moment it appeared, equipment inside the station began going haywire, including some old equipment that hadn't been used since the 1950s. Some of it wasn't even plugged into an outlet. And then, not that far away, two boys, Gumercindo Alicia and Edwin Valdez, were playing kickball in a field near the radio station at the same time when they saw something different. They had chased their ball to the edge of the forest, and when they went to retrieve it, they saw what can only be described as a chupacabra. 4 feet tall, large red eyes shaped like ovals, a row of spines going down its back. Yet, somehow, despite how terrifying this sounds, neither of the boys said that they were afraid. Later, Gumercindo wondered if the creature hadn't exercised some sort of mind control on them to try and keep them calm. Well, the sightings actually continued that night. Someone in a house near the radio station had claimed that a circle of light appeared in the field where the boys had been playing. Plus, there was also another chupacabra sighting in that neighborhood late in the evening. Doris Malave Matos said that she watched as a two-legged creature headed up a hill and then vanished into a light coming from the other side. Now, clearly, there seemed to be some sort of connection here, but what is it? Sightings like this one suggest that the chupacabra might be an alien. After all, these original descriptions sound a lot like a gray. But what if that isn't the case? What if the chupacabra is the product of government experiments? Like I said earlier in the video, the location where Madeline Tolentino had her sighting is right on the border of the El Yunque National Forest. You see, among other things, this area was once a chemical testing ground. In fact, it was the first place on Earth that the United States government tested Agent Orange, used in herbicidal warfare in the Vietnam War. Now, while supposedly only designed to decimate vegetation, we all know how that went, Agent Orange has a profound impact on human beings. In short, it has been clearly demonstrated to cause certain cancers and other horrific disabilities. And as a matter of fact, soldiers training in El Yunque in the 1960s had filed complaints against the United States government for Agent Orange exposure. Yeah, you heard me right. The United States military trains in El Yunque National Forest. It began as a temporary command in 1934, but it's never really ever left. World War II led to a permanent military presence in El Yunque, part of defense efforts to fortify the Caribbean against attack. Now, over the years, it has been home to a detachment of the U.S. Army, a guided missile operations control unit led by the U.S. Navy, and even gamma radiation research. Now, this research was conducted in the Luquillo Experimental Forest. Now, what is that, you might ask yourself? Here's a mind-blowing fact. The official United States Department of Agriculture website entry on the Luquillo Experimental Forest says this. Luquillo Experimental Forest is the largest tropical forest in the experimental forest and range system, and the only experimental forest with the same boundary as the national forest, that is El Yunque National Forest and the Luquillo are one. Again, you heard that right, folks. There is a national forest doubling as an experimental forest, the only one of its kind. And all around its border, people see UFOs and small blood-sucking monsters. Clearly, this relationship lends itself to plenty of conspiracy theories, and people have speculated that the chupacabra is just the next evolution in biological warfare, a creature cooked up in a lab. And no, folks, not a meth lab. That's Chico, California. After all, in concept, a government-made chupacabra isn't really that different from Agent Orange. Agent Orange targeted plants, the Chupacabra targeted animals. Maybe there's a scenario where the military plan to release a herd of these things behind enemy lines to deplete their livestock. I mean, who knows? Other people drew UFOs into the conspiracy itself. In fact, Scott Corrales described some of these theories in a June 2000 blog post. He wrote this: "In some scenarios, the Chupacabras was an alien creature dumped on Earth by aliens for study, while the Army Rangers and other special forces kept the unwary at bay. In other scenarios, the military turned a blind eye to the creature's depredations, possibly in exchange for advanced technology, which was also being tested over the island." I mean, it all seems too weird to be a coincidence, right? You've got all these sightings of creatures and crafts around the forest. Wouldn't it be weirder if they weren't somehow related? Well, it all seems really tidy until you consider the fact that Chupacabras aren't just found in Puerto Rico. In fact, since 1995, reports of these creatures have expanded all over the world. Today, sightings of similar animals have come from places as far away as Russia. But there's something else that's interesting. You can actually trace the spread of Chupacabras out from Puerto Rico and across the world. After the Puerto Rican sightings, the next ones happened in Miami, then Mexico, then all across Latin America and the southwestern United States. Does this suggest something? Maybe the possible transmission of a myth? Or a creature that was released in Puerto Rico and then somehow found its way to the mainland and just spread like wildfire? Who knows? Unfortunately, the truth behind this mysterious Spanish blood-sucking being will probably more than likely continue to remain a mystery. And I tell you what, we've left a ton of Chupacabra stuff on the table. I mean, we have so many more sightings that we could talk about, including all the weird dogs that people keep seeing, but sadly there's just too much to cover for one episode. So if you guys enjoyed this and want to see a continuation, please go ahead and let me know down below. And since you guys made it this far into the video, I want you guys to all comment down below, "Don't suck my goat." Yeah, if you do that, I'll know exactly who made it to the end of the video and, well, who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling of the strange, supernatural, and mysterious, and the unexplained, what are you waiting for? Slap that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. And as always, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the very next video.